50 Years is an early stage seed fund, seed investment firm, I should say, based in San Francisco. We back founders solving the world's biggest problems with technology. We've been around for 5 years, backed 77, 8 companies to date, and have really been focused on making sure that playing a very, very tiny part there, but like making sure that the planet survives and we can help solve the climate crisis we're in, helping remove animals from global supply chains, making access to affordable healthcare, both from like the diagnostics and therapeutics perspective, much easier. So these are some of the themes. We have started this event series called Impact.Tech actually before starting 50 Years. So it's been running for a while. The main idea is that it used to be kind of events in San Francisco where the community would get together and PhDs and researchers could meet other entrepreneurs, and second time founders who are kind of working on their next thing, and maybe they want to spend their time working on something more meaningful. And also all in the two groups of people would meet investors as well. It's been a little harder. It's been harder, as we know, in COVID, so we moved those events online, but there's going to be the very, very, very exciting today, and I've seen that presentation before, content part delivered by Wojtek, which actually I'm sure you will really enjoy. And then we'll have a little bit of time to meet each other in the breakout room.
Great, yeah. So the U.S. Chemicals industry accounts for 25% of GDP in this country, but 40% of industrial waste. So it is definitely not an industry synonymous with clean. But we're all going to try and change that. So clean chemicals, or also sometimes known as green chemicals, promise to deliver the exact same products that we all know and love, while dramatically reducing their environmental footprint and potentially even moving beyond the functionality that we can get with petroleum-based products. It's meant to put a stake in the heart of the petrochemical industry and sort of move us off of fossil fuels, fossil fuel supply chain. A lot of what's happening in this space comes from advancements in biotechnology and synthetic biology, like things like CRISPR, directed evolution of enzymes that allow us to do things that we just simply couldn't do 10, 15 years ago. So today we're going to get a brief overview of the forces shaping the chemical industry at large. We're going to go through the 12 principles of green chemistry with a particular focus on the atom economy, which is super interesting. And then we're going to look at the competitive dynamics in the space, tech innovation, market forces, market players, why the existing chemical industry really hasn't innovated all that much, and what may be next, and then how we can all contribute and get involved. So today's seminar is going to be led by Wojtek Olszowiecki.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Boom. After getting a joint bachelor's and master's degree in chemistry from Yale, Wojtek got his PhD in chemistry from UC Berkeley, and he's currently a process engineer at Lam Research. Wojtek actually researched the electrochemical conversion of carbon dioxide to fuels as a method of renewable energy storage and emission-neutral clean chemical production. He's a 2018 Siebel Scholar in Energy Science and participated in the Clean Tech to Market program at Berkeley Haas. But most importantly, he is a former 50 Years fellow. So with that, Wojtek, please.
I'll say one more thing. I actually were chatting right before this with Wojtek, and I realized we actually run a clean air accelerator a few years ago, which was called Smogathon, which was mostly inspired by the fact that Poland, which we're both originally from Poland, now both live in the US, but has pretty bad air quality. And I think just like being in Bay Area recently, it's kind of eerie how, and Wojtek was kind of the local lead for California for the Smogathon, for the clean air. So he's very knowledgeable on the technologies in this space as well. So it's who would have thought that would be a local problem as well.
And with that, Wojtek, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, guys, for this really warm introduction. I am certainly a proud former fellow at 50 Years. It's been a fantastic summer. And it is true that we have met during Smogathon. So it all started with air quality. And for those of you who are on the West Coast, air quality is something that is definitely very heavily on our minds right now. And obviously, this topic will be connected to what I'm presenting on, as climate change as well as air pollution's got a lot to do with chemical industry. So let me share my presentation. All right, are you able to see it? Awesome. Okay, so my name is Wojciech Osowiecki, or Wojtek. I go by Wojtek. Don't worry about the spelling. And let me, yeah, briefly about me. Already was introduced, so I don't want to repeat myself. Right now, I work in the semiconductor space. So I just want to start with saying that you can think of me as an outsider. I definitely don't consider myself as a ultra deep expert on chemical industry. I know that people are attending this seminar, and I'm hoping that we'll have some fun conversation. Feel free to ask questions. If something is urgent, just chat Kayla, and she's authorized to interrupt if something is confusing, and I'll be happy to just take the question on the spot. We'll have 3 chances to ask questions because the seminar is split into 3 parts. And yeah, like I said, with all the expertise that we have online on this Zoom call, I'm hoping for some good conversation. I'm going to present you with what I've learned studying this space, working with 50 years, as well as doing my PhD. But, the space is accelerating very fast. I was really happy to see very good changes over the last year when I was updating this seminar. So I'm hoping to go deep. And if you guys want to go deeper, let's just keep the conversation open. All right, so the roadmap was also mentioned by Seth. So we're going to open with a little bit of history, as well as an introduction to green chemistry and its principles. Then in part 2, we're going to go over the general chemical process, because I do think that there are certain ways of thinking about that you can use, especially if you're not a chemistry expert, that will kind of help you to see the big picture here and not get bogged down by all the scary names and variety of levels of difficulty here. And then we're going to finish the part with talking about the current market situation. We're going to go over both incumbents in the space, as well as a lot of new and really exciting startups. And lastly, we're going to dream bigger. We're going to look at the future targets. We're going to talk about how we can survive and thrive in this market, which is full of multi-billion-dollar incumbents, and sort of what lies ahead for the industry and honestly for the entire planet, because the fate of the chemical industry, in my belief, is really closely linked to the fate of our civilization. All right, so when it comes to a brief history of this industry, I wish it started in a nicer way, but a lot of it has to do with war. Wars are known to bring forth a lot of innovation. I wish it was done in a more polite and human-friendly way. But the sad reality of the chemical industry is that it started during World War I, before an Industrial Revolution, and then it continued in World War II. And there's been many big advancements in the chemical industry over this period. For example, the discovery of a lot of different artificial materials, plastics. A lot of them go by the name of polymers. So for those of you who may not be familiar with what a polymer is a long chain molecule that it's repeating the same sequence of a monomer over and over again. And we'll spend a lot of time talking about the polymers. So just wanted to get it out of the way. And then, the growth has been happening continuously from the World War II, definitely into the 1970s. This is the time for an economic boom. Like I said, there is a big connection between the overall economy and how chemical industry is doing. So in the US, the decades of 60s and 70s have been a lot of consumer growth, and the consumer growth is propelling us into all kind of chemical discoveries, ranging from nicer paints, nicer textiles, materials that we use for the automotive industry. Certainly, agriculture has been changed in a variety of different ways. And then we had a crisis. In the 1970s, the oil crisis came that I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard about. US realized that it's heavily dependent on oil coming from the Middle East. And it turns out that you cannot have chemical industry, at least in the past, without oil. Pretty much the entirety of the feedstock of the chemical industry was oil. So the oil crisis wasn't just about the beginning of renewable energy as well as initiatives such as Environmental Protection Agency, it's also been about thinking how else can we run a chemical industry. And only in the 1970s we started thinking more seriously about detaching from oil. And then another important stuff that has been happening is pharma. So it turned out that the classic incumbents in that space have not been very well equipped into going into biology. Biology is a big driver of innovation, especially when genetic engineering started. We were able to create many drugs from different ways than just say slaughtering a bunch of animals, which and a good example would be insulin. There are many big companies such as Genentech that started around that era that were able to capitalize on the discovery of biotechnology and genetic engineering. And here the chemical industry started falling a little behind because that oil addiction that I've been telling you about and will be clear throughout my presentation hasn't really shifted. So we can say that pharma for sure created its own industry that is a little more based on fermentation processes, while chemicals stayed with such classic things like plastics, textiles, and just a lot of other things that derive from oil. So if I was to summarize everything I just said, and then I guess the last thing is the restructuring. So that's where it gets even more set for chemical industry. So past 2000s, we can say that there's been a lot of mergers and acquisitions, a lot of moving money from one place to another, but not necessarily investments into R&D that created a lot of new material boom that we have, say, observed from the 1920s to the 1970s. So if I was to summarize it, sorry for the clicking problems, we got chemical products discovery, and then there's a question, what now? Are we stuck in the space of constant, reshuffling and just building another multi-billion-dollar plant that makes stuff out of oil? Well, as we all know, the answer is no, we cannot continue this way. And the reason for this is the environmental impact of the chemical industry. The industry is responsible for about 5% US GDP, supports 20%, and it generates, like Seth said, 40% of the US industrial waste. And the image here, I could swear, was taken yesterday in San Francisco. For everyone who's in the South Bay knows exactly what I'm talking about. The air quality has been just horrendous here. And fortunately for chemical industry, we're not the one to blame. It's just the forest fires. But, it is true that a lot of the waste that goes into air, that goes into rivers, and also in our blood, as you can see, 212 chemicals and pollutants present in our blood, according to CDC, those are really scary, numbers. And what's important to consider is that chemical industry, like I said, is tied to general economy, and it also means that it's tied to population. The industry has been improving in terms of safety and toxicity standards per kilogram of product, but the industry demands definitely scale with population. And as you know, the global population is growing, and everyone in the world deserves to have the same quality of life as Americans do. And if we are to provide the same amount of plastics, amount of other materials to the entire population as we've done in the past, it will be a big problem. So, the two big challenges that we'll be talking about are greenhouse gases and the climate change, as well as the plastics. Okay, so let's talk more about the environmental movement. That there's not one obvious origination of it, but I think a good place to start is to talk about The Silent Spring, which is a book written by Rachel Carson in the 60s. She's definitely one of the heroes of the environmental movement because she was a trained biochemist, and she realized that pesticides being used in this era, primarily DDT, has been responsible for death of a lot of birds. The name Silent Spring comes from the fact that the birds were supposedly no more singing. And she really sort of started the movement of awareness that, all the benefits that I outlined in my previous slides, like, proverbial nylon or the nice textiles, are coming with the price. And the price is the externalities of toxicity. So she started the movement, and we've definitely seen a lot of shift towards consumer awareness, and investors are jumping on board as well. So in the last year or two, ESG investing is a term that is being more and more popular. And that means that we're still trying to make money and think of how this industry, as well as any other, is a good investment. But big companies such as BlackRock start saying that climate risk is one of the investment risks. So that really gives us a very good stimuli for this industry to consider change. And like I said, as we see the increasing growth in consumer willingness to pay more money for eco-friendly products, that's another good reason to consider that we may be able to see some exciting things in this space. All right, so what is actually green chemistry, the term that I've been using before? Obviously, there's not just one good definition, but the way I like to think about it is started by the Paul Anestas, who was a professor at Yale, and he came with the 12 principles that I will cover later. But the first thing I want you guys to know is that simply green chemistry is good for business. And that's the list of the advantages of green chemistry here is actually given by EPA. So even in Trump's era, the Environmental Protection Agency is still believing in green chemistry, which is certainly good news for all of us. And why is it actually being good for business? Well, first of all, it's a lot about saving and a lot about making increasing efficiency and reducing waste. So we can see higher yields for a given chemical reaction. We want to look at manufacturing plants that are more compact in size and are able to take feedstock of smaller volume, and all of it means effectively savings. So our costs can go down. And secondly, like I said in the previous slide, since there is a growing movement of consumers that are willing to pay more for eco-friendly products, we can also start talking about increasing revenue. So if you forget everything from my talk, just please remember this simple figure that green chemistry is good for us on both fronts. We're going to have increased revenue and we're going to decrease costs. Obviously, things will get a little more complicated, but that really is the ambition behind the entire movement here. All right, so the aforementioned principle of green chemistry that came up, I think, more than 2 decades now, are a good way to start of sort of learning and thinking about the whole space. So I'm not going to go by everything side by side because I know that you guys will have access to this presentation anyway, but I'm happy to discuss a few of them a little more depth. So we're going to start with waste prevention, something I already mentioned on my previous slides. So it seems kind of obvious, but waste prevention is better than cleanup or treatment. So just like in our house, if we can just avoid having a mess, it's better than dumping a lot of stuff on our floor and then spending a lot of time trying to clean it up. In industry, it's quite similar. And a good way to quantify things is to look at something called E factor or environmental factor, which is total waste divided by product. So it turns out that the environmental factor is dramatically different based on where we are in the chemical industry. It turns out that at the most extreme cases, things like pharmaceuticals are actually producing 100 kilograms of waste for 1 kilogram of product. I don't know if that's news to you guys, but the first time I heard it, this number was clearly mind-blowing to me. I was like, how the heck is it possible that they're producing 100 times more waste for one kilogram or gram of something useful? But that comes with the appreciation of how complicated the chemical transitions are in this space, but also with the fact that pretty much everything starts from oil. I'll have some slides on it later, but like I said, if you think about that, if we start from this one feedstock and then we make all our pharmaceuticals from this one space, obviously there has to be many steps down the road, and each step has some imperfect yield, which means waste generation every single step. And this kind of lets us understand why this environmental factor is looking kind of bad. When it comes to things like bulk chemicals, which again is just commodity chemicals you sell on a large scale, we're talking about millions of tons of annual production. The environmental factor is looking somewhat better, but still, it's almost the same amount of waste produced per kilogram of product, which is somewhat scary. And then last time I was giving this talk, somebody asked me how fermentation is looking compared to traditional oil techniques, and it comes to be about the same. If you're looking at a standard fermentation technique, we're still at the environmental factor of about 1. And that's actually a good segue for me to tell you that it is good to use metrics such as this one, but it's also very important to know what it actually means. So for example, in fermentation, it turns out that a lot of the waste is actually just water or salt water, things that are intoxic, like organic products. It's good to start simple, and e-factor is a good way to do it. But people have been saying and looking at other more complicated metrics that takes into account energy and particularly how much of toxic stuff we're producing. Because if you have a choice between waste from fermentation and waste from oil refining, it may actually mean that you may want to go for fermentation, even if it makes a little more waste. So, as everything I'll be telling you today, in the chemical industry, things can get very quickly complicated, and there are always exceptions from the rule. So it's always good to do your research and stay educated on things. But every now and then a shorthand is nice, and that's where the E factor comes in. All right, so atom economy has already been previewed by Seth. So what it is that we look at the percentage of useful atoms divided by all used atoms. And the example I like giving is this product where we produce ethylene glycol, or MEG, MEG. MEG is being used as a precursor for a variety of things, including a ton of plastics and PET. So I think it's a $25 billion industry every year to make ethylene glycol. And it turns out that you can say, okay, I want to make it from something like sugar, which is not oil, and that's good. But you also want to think about how many atoms are being wasted and where those atoms go. So it turns out that in order to make ethanol from sugar in the standard process, you have to ferment it and you have CO2. And if you just let the CO2 go to the atmosphere, as it usually happens, we're actually going to have a bigger problem with climate change. So what Haldor Topsy and Braskem, a big Brazilian oil company, came up with is this new process that takes sugar and uses pyrolysis, which is high temperature process without exposure to oxygen. And you are able to break those sugars without any CO2 escaping to the atmosphere. And that means that every atom that you're actually needing in ethylene glycol goes where it needs to go. You don't have any of the waste. And that can be pretty huge because no matter what kind of skillful chemical engineering you're doing or how good you are in marketing and building your business, it always goes down in chemical industry to the primary chemistry and what kind of process you're using, right? So this is the maximum best efficiency you can ever get, because if for every molecule of sugar we're getting 1 molecule of CO2, there's nothing that good chemical engineering or good business skills can do. So I always emphasize that part, that in this whole industry, there are many levels of looking and thinking about things. But I always like to go back to chemistry because, it does feel a little more academic, but that's really the sort of the best we can ever get, the ideal world that we can ever live in. And from there, we're only going to have more inefficiencies in our process. So, like I said, always good to think about atom economy too. All right. Catalysis. That one is probably common for a lot of you guys in the talk, but just very briefly, what catalytic reagents are certain chemicals that are able to lower the energy barrier that is needed to produce our products from reactants. And what's awesome about that is the catalyst can be used over and over again. Of course, there's some wear and tear, but compared to using so-called stoichiometric reagents, they're usually efficient because, as you can see again, we can increase our atom economy. So in this specific example, if we use a stoichiometric reagent, i.e. the same ratio of molecules for each of the production, if I want to have more of my product, I have to lose more and more atoms. But if I have a very high percent atom economy, which is enabled by catalyst, and I also can lower my energy, which means that I can operate lower temperature perhaps, then I'm really in a good place because I'm still getting what I need, but I reduce my waste, which is good for the planet and good for the business. And then scale matters in everything I just said. So you start with your sort of academic drawings of, specific reactions, but very quickly ask yourself a question. So how can I actually do it? And when I was in grad school, this thing that you can see on the left was considered a big scale. I believe that's something like a 2 liter, maybe 5 liter round bottom flask. And I honestly have never used it in my grad school. It was way too large. But compared to anything that a startup would even consider, that's still way too small. And you can see that the complexity of the systems that we need in the chemical industry is growing very quickly. And every time you grow something, that means that your waste, your energy, and your general risk is growing. And all these things means higher costs. So as we're going to larger scales, the principle of green chemistry matter more and more and more because your costs are exponentially growing. And one example that I was recently given is simply just the cost of the chemical plant, such as the one you see on the right. In the 70s, you could build a plant for, let's say, maybe $100 million. And I'm talking about, modern dollars. And now you may have to spend 3,000, like three times more, maybe $300 million. And that's simply because the safety standards are growing and growing in this industry, which is obviously great for the workers and partially for our planet. But you may want to start thinking about completely changing your process and going simply to safer things. So then again, green chemistry is shining because it's say, completely replace your solvents and don't even think about still running things in those, dangerous ways because you keep paying steeper and steeper penalty when it comes to cost simply. And why is it not easy to apply all these principles to chemical industry? Because, like I said, they certainly sound really nice. Well, first thing is commodity pricing. So it's very fortunate for us because we can use plastics and other things very cheaply. But it also means that the margins are very, very thin on those products, and you have to optimize the heck out of everything you're making in order to be cost competitive. And you also have to make it on a huge scale. So I already said that people are willing to pay more, but more usually means maybe 10, 20% more. But if you're starting with a new process, there's no way you can compete with an incumbent that's working on million-ton scale and has been spending decades to optimize a certain process. So, the pricing is definitely a big problem here. And the second one is simply capital heaviness. As opposed to, a software app or a lot of other industries that you can jump start quite quickly. If you want to do anything in the chemical industry, very quickly you'll be faced with quite heavy capital costs, and the scaling is a big challenge. And again, the incumbents have all the resources, both in terms of money and in terms of skill, to know how to do those things well. And like I said, they've been doing them for quite a long time. So they're not always incentivized fully to change their processes, because if you invest, $10 billion in a plant, you really want to go towards a complete depreciation. So those things are really built over decades of use. And if you stick with one process, you try to optimize things for this specific process very, very highly. And then, switching is just very costly for the entire industry. So as you can see, there's certainly real barriers to innovations. The addiction to fossil fuels is the first one. At the moment, about 90% of the entire chemical production of anything you associate with the industry comes from oil. And I like to think of this oil tanker you can see on the right, because turning something in the industry often feels as hard as changing this boat that was probably carrying an oil to one of the ethylene cracker plants somewhere. So everything we're going to talk here is on a big scale. The scale of industry means that the economics are hard because of the commodity pricing, but also simply when it comes to expertise of the incumbents. They have the volume, they know the supply chain, and they can hire the best and brightest straight out of universities. So the scale of the industry can be quite challenging. And I already mentioned the capabilities of those incumbents. The industry as whole is not moving very fast, but obviously it is investing in R&D. The big companies are not just sitting and doing nothing. They are trying to optimize their processes, and they are trying to be as safe and as efficient as they can. While they're not willing to take risks like the small companies that I'll be telling you later about are willing to do, they are putting quite a lot of efforts into making their products more and more efficient. So whoever wants to enter this space should be aware of it. It's no gloom, but it's good to start with some realistic perspective. So the way I think about it, it's kind of a half full and half empty glass. The incumbents just seem too big, too established, and honestly too efficient to compete with. But the other way to think about that is that the consumer demand is rising while the market is too stagnant. So it is the time for a clean chemical revolution.